Dr. Brian Klaas is an assistant professor in global politics at University College London. He's also a columnist for the Washington Post, an author and regular media contributor, usually on the subject of Donald Trump's presidency. Apart from US politics and democracy, he specialises in authoritarian leadership, and he brings all those topics together in a series of books, including The Despot's Apprentice, Donald Trump's Attack on Democracy, and How to Rig an Election. He first gained public attention on Twitter for his posts that debunk what he sees as false statements made by the president. Here he talks to me about the good, the bad and the ugly of politics, social media and the dictators and terrorists that he's spent time with. Fear is something he both studies and is driven by. Brian, thanks for speaking to me.
It's my pleasure.
And allowing me into your office. So you're primarily an academic, at least that's how you made your name. How did you end up in academia?
Well, actually, after I graduated from my undergraduate college, I moved to New Zealand, and I was going to become a ski instructor. That failed because I arrived too late. Then I became a bartender for a bit, and I worked then in U.S. politics. I returned back home to co-manage a campaign. Of course, as with all these things, the route I took was circuitous. So I got hired as the driver for the campaign, literally driving the candidate around. And a couple months later, I was the deputy campaign manager. So things worked out in a very fortuitous way for me. But you know what happened actually, and this is ironic in 2018, but I left U.S. politics after we won that campaign because I thought American politics had become boring. I thought they sort of just worked. They had, occasionally bizarre characters, but they tended to work. And so I decided to study international politics, and that's where I applied widely, and Oxford University accepted me. When Oxford gives you a letter, it's hard to say no, so I moved across the pond, and several years later, here I am, still in academia, but doing many other things as well.
But did you want to go into politics, or did you want to study politics?
I wanted to use my career to try to affect change, and when I was a kid, I thought about, I want to be president. Since then, I've sort of changed, and I want to influence decision-making. I want to be somebody who's part of the conversation when it comes to policy change. I want to leave the world better than I inherited it, but I don't think that I will end up doing that through public office, at least as of now.
Is that because you think it's more effective to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think that just because of my nationality, I would have to run in America, and it's a complete cesspool right now. I mean, it's a terrible place to be a politician. You just get beat up on all sides. You can't win, and you have to constantly fundraise. I mean, that was one of the very dark sides I saw of political campaigns when I worked on one. I worked for somebody who I actually admired quite a lot, but he was independently wealthy, so he didn't have to fundraise. But everybody around us who was in that same game, the opponents, the fellow candidates in the race, their workers were trying to figure out whether they were going to get paid because it was effectively all fundraising all the time. And it just seemed to be, a very grim business to me. And I sort of thought, I can write, I can speak out, and I can be engaged in policymaking without actually doing it myself.
Brings us on to Donald Trump. And you're a fierce critic of Donald Trump, but there are many of them, particularly here in London. But you've used Twitter, am I right in saying, to voice your concerns about him? How did that start?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of the ways that I speak out. So what effectively happened was I studied my PhD on authoritarianism and authoritarian populism in the rest of the world. And I became an expert on how, democracy gets undermined and how authoritarian tactics succeed in places over there, so to speak. So I did field research in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, etc. And then when Donald Trump arrived on the American political scene, I started to hear echoes of what I had heard in, places around the world that are much less democratic. And so I felt it was incumbent on me to speak out about the warning signs that I saw in him. I did so on Twitter to start. And people started to pick up on the tweets that I was producing. I was doing some op-ed writing for a variety of outlets like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, occasionally the New York Times, things like that. And over time, I started to develop more of a following on Twitter, responding to events in real time. I also started writing a Washington Post column, which, all of this stuff was symbiotic in a way because people who read the column then would go and follow me on Twitter. People who read my tweets would go and look at my column. Then people in media like yourself started to take notice, and I started to do more television and radio on the BBC and CNN and Sky and a variety of other outlets, MSNBC in the US. And all of that sort of contributed. But I think social media has an advantage in that it's a rapid response that genuine experts can provide context and information about current events. And I think one of the things that is slightly different about that with traditional media sources is it's not genuinely instantaneous. I mean, I can craft a response to a Trump tweet within 10 seconds of him tweeting. And I think that that's something that has been a comparative edge that I've had. I actually have... I've turned this off now, finally, but for about a year, I had my phone buzzing every time that Donald Trump tweeted, which was, I got to say, I don't recommend it. But it was something that professionally I wanted to be, really dialed into what was happening and what he was saying. And in real time, debunking some of the lies that he's spread, I think is very important because he has a massive platform, and some of that, misinformation that he's spreading needs to be checked and called out quickly. And a lot of the people consuming his tweets on social media are not going to read the follow-up piece on the New York Times or the Washington Post, say, 12 to 24 hours later. And so if it's not out there, he can sort of get away with a lot more. And I felt a duty to speak out that way.
You're obviously opinionated, but you're very big on accuracy as well, aren't you? Effectively, what you do is you pick apart his tweets. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm trying to debunk a lot of things that he says, and I'm also trying to talk about his strategies that he's using that worry me. I tend to speak out about things that I think should be nonpartisan. So one of the things that alarms me with Trump is his, I think to be charitable, you'd say casual relationship with the truth. I think most people could acceptably call him a liar because he's made demonstrably false statements thousands of times since becoming president. And I don't think that lies are partisan. I think that people of both, Democrats and Republican stripes should be able to agree that dishonesty in politicians should be called out. I also think that there's fundamental values around the U.S. that Trump is attacking. Things like the idea that the press is important in a democracy. And I can tell you from studying places that are not democratic, it is absolutely essential to have a free press that is respected and looked up to by citizens. Beyond that, the idea that you shouldn't scapegoat minorities because they're minorities for their religious or ethnic views. Attacks on rule of law. These sort of pillars of democracy in America combined with presidential lies. That is the sort of bread and butter about what I speak out about. And, the really alarming thing to me is that saying those things, saying that this is demonstrably false and I can prove it, or saying that we should value the press or we shouldn't attack people because their skin color is different, that has gotten me labeled as a hack for the Democrats, which I think is really alarming because what I'm saying everybody agreed on, say, in 2014. This was not controversial. John McCain could have written my Twitter feed. So could have Lindsey Graham at the time. And so to me, the really big worry is that people look at a Twitter feed like mine where I'm saying this is not true. And they say, oh, you're a shill. And that's not true. I'm just somebody who's correcting false statements. And I think we should be able to agree that that's a part of democracy. Unfortunately, in this very weird time we're in, it makes you seem partisan to try to debunk the president's lies.
You're very successful on Twitter. Obviously, your voice is much bigger than Twitter, but because of the times we're in, if I could focus on social media and what you think makes a successful Twitter feed and what that says about society, because you're quite often expressing how your followers feel, simply, aren't you?
Well, yeah, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy there. The people who follow me tend to agree with me. I think this one of the really insidious sides of social media that's a problem is that you do have this sort of all or nothing approach. You can say something that breaks with the mindset of many of your followers and you'll start to lose followers. And there's a built-in incentive mechanism for you to sort of preach to the choir, so to speak, because that's what people amplify, that's what people want. And that's not good, right? We need to have the idea that you can disagree with someone and still be worth listening to them. But that being said, I think there are some things that I've picked up on that traditional experts might be not as good at, with throwing modesty out the window. But one thing that I think has worked for me is I have, I try to make sure that all of the tweets are pithy with, witty turns of phrase as much as I can, straight to the point as much as I can, clear debunking of lies with numbers, but very, very straightforward. And I think that you take away all the academic jargon, you take away all the sort of flowery language around tweets, and you sort of get straight to the point, and that's what people want to consume. They want to understand your argument in a very, very short, series of words. It's gotten a little bit less selective because they've expanded the character limit. I mean, it used to be much harder, and I would spend 10 minutes crafting a tweet to make sure it had the most punch for the words that I'd chosen. It's gotten a little easier, but still, I think that sort of directness is something that people like on Twitter. And I also think that you should not be afraid to speak out in your opinion, because one of the things that I think actually does a disservice in a way to people in the Twitter sphere or even in media is to pretend that they don't have opinions. Everybody does. And I think if you're coming from a basic set of values, you can express them in a sort of reasonable way. I tend not to engage on questions around tax policy or healthcare policy because I think that's a normal part of the ebb and flow of the democratic process. Trump is not that different on a lot of those issues than a mainstream Republican would be. So I'm not particularly alarmed by it, even though I know that the policies will be highly consequential. My role here, the way I see myself, is somebody who's pushing back on the idea that we should have guardrails for the democracy, institutions, lies, all these things that I said. And on Twitter, that's one way that people have started to pick up on that message, but it's certainly not the only one.
You still do it a lot more quickly than other people, as much as you say you taught yourselves over 10 minutes, but it would take a lot of other people a lot longer to write what you write. So you've found a platform that really works for you. You're a very articulate person and you're an academic. How did you find that? Because that's allowed you to succeed, hasn't it, in a way, a lot of your media appearances?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an overlapping set of skills that exist on both Twitter and on traditional media platforms, and that includes column writing, actually. When you have a column, you end up having somebody who reads it, and if they're going to take anything away from it that's new, it's going to be a turn of phrase that they might then use in their own conversation. The same is true for Twitter, the same is true for TV appearances. I mean, it's effectively the soundbite, right? I mean, it's the traditional soundbite, but in tweet form or in column form. And I think the best people on Twitter are those who understand not just how to have a good turn of phrase, but also a smart juxtaposition. So an example of a tweet that I had recently that took off very well, and it was just sort of something in the back of my mind, was this whole business about Trump not pushing back against Saudi Arabia for murdering one of my colleagues at the Washington Post. And I drew attention to the fact that Trump had a much harsher reaction when Nordstrom, the department store, pulled Ivanka's fashion line, which is objectively true. I mean, he lashed out at Nordstrom aggressively on Twitter, spoke about them in very derogatory terms publicly. And you compare that to what he's done with Saudi Arabia allegedly dismembering a reporter, and it's jarring. So on Twitter that took off not because I'm some sort of secret genius about this. It's just thinking about, okay, how can we juxtapose these things in a clever way that gets people attention and throws it into very sharp contrast quickly. And that's what I tried to do in that tweet, and people responded to it. So I think sometimes it's about those clever turns of phrases and also about ensuring that you create juxtapositions in your analysis that really stick in people's minds. And
you've ended up being more influential than a lot of politicians. So whilst you wanted to have an influence on politics, you took a different route from the traditional one, and you found this one. So what's the mindset around that sort of openness to opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the when you think about what causes success, I think there's a few things that have stuck in my mind. I think that I certainly can't take credit for all of it. I've been very often the product of good circumstances and also of luck. But I think one thing that I've noticed in people that I've seen who tend to be successful is that when luck strikes, they take advantage of it. And that basically happened to me. So, luck struck with me in a way for developing a traditional media profile through a tweet that I sent, where I was quoted in the New York Times with a tweet. And then that led to the media department at my university taking note of me. And then when they got media requests, they sort of said, here, try, Dr. Klaas, he's somebody who can talk about this. And opportunity knocked in sort of a completely happenstance way. I did not reach out to CNN or to other news outlets. But when it did, I made sure I was prepared. I thought about how to do it, and I practiced a bit. And now media appearances, you just sort of roll up to the studio and do them. But the initial time, I mean, I can remember very well that my heart was beating out of my chest. I was so nervous. My head was bobbing with every question like a lunatic. It was a really nerve-wracking thing for me. But I sort of said to myself, look, this doesn't happen to people all the time. And so I'm going to try to make the most of it. And I think that's worked very well for me, is that, it's sort of taking advantage of those times when fortune smiles upon you. And, maybe I am luckier than the average person, but I do think that there is this question of what do you do with luck that often ends up creating success in a lot of people. And I've been very fortunate to be the product of that.
You work hard and you're very driven. Is that because you're very passionate about your cause, or is there something else pushing you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think it is something that was instilled in me from a very young age. The sort of work ethic. My dad actually, he'll laugh that I'm telling this, but he had this thing that we had to do when we were kids, when we were like 13 years old, 14 years old, which is basically where you literally had to have your butt in the chair at your desk for 2 hours per night after dinner. And it didn't matter if you were doing homework, but you couldn't leave your chair. And the idea was that you had to do your homework. So I did my homework. So he instilled that in me. And then also, he had this other very funny thing that he would do where he would effectively say, when I would bring home a test that was, say, 97 out of 100, and he would say, what happened to the other 3? Yeah. But it was, so from a very young age, my parents, and I really thank them for this now, actually. Yeah. I mean, I think at the time I thought it was very annoying, but I like that they insisted on excellence, because it helped me. But beyond that, there's that evolved into sort of a question about what I wanted to do with my life. And I wasn't motivated by finances straight out of undergrad. The thing that really stuck with me was that the two things that mattered to me were relationships with people I cared about and impact on the world. And so, the latter is the thing that I try to dedicate my career to and spend my time with. And through my research, I have seen some really dark sides of politics. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of torture victims, dissidents, families of dissidents who have been killed, rebels and coup plotters and people like this. And so I've sort of seen how bad things can get, and that's really motivated me to try to speak out to ensure that the sort of privilege that we have in democratic societies in the West is preserved. And that's where I've really sort of been working for the last 10 years of my life is about shoring up and fixing the problems of democracy in Western societies. You've had to get into the minds of people who you think are evil, right? What have you learned about their success? This is a great question. So I've interviewed a lot of really evil people, people who have killed large numbers of protesters. I recently interviewed somebody who is a bioterrorist who poisoned a bunch of people. And the thing that's jarring about it the most is that they're usually nice. I mean, like I say this and it sounds really weird, but you have a one-on-one encounter and you've read about the person, you know what they did, they're guilty, that they had a decision at some point in their lives that resulted in the deaths of a lot of innocent people, or at least the intent to kill a lot of innocent people. And then, you sort of shake their hand and they're kind to you and they're a human, right? They're you sort of want this caricature to be that they're this inhuman monster. And in fact, they're human with some charm usually and things like that. So that's one of the most jarring things. In terms of how they develop their success, I mean, that's part of it probably, right? I mean, these people who are genuinely evil being able to convince you that they're not, or make you feel that they're not, is a recipe for success in politics sometimes, because there are people in politics who make genuinely evil decisions and yet they're supported. And I think if people understood the sort of raw nature of that person, they would never vote for them or never support them. And that's a personality trait that certain people who gravitate towards positions of power, particularly in authoritarian societies, tend to share, is they really know how to manipulate people and they really know how to present themselves, or to spin decisions in ways that sound like they're for the greater good, so to speak. And I've encountered a lot of people who, on the surface of it, have charmed me in a way, even as I'm, when I write about them, I'm objective about the fact that they've done some truly, truly awful and despicable and hate-filled things.
Do you think successful people are driven by fear? I mean, you've described how hope plays into a lot of what you do. You've got this, this issue you want to address, and you talked about relationships being important as well. Evil people want to have control, don't they? But is that enough? Do they not have to be very insecure as well to push through and work as hard as they do?
Yeah, I mean, fear is a motivator, particularly in politics. So one of my favorite stats from my research is that I crunched the numbers on how often people who lose power in Africa, for example, end up with some very bad outcomes. And since 1960, nearly half of people who lost power, dictators and despots and figures like that, lost power, either end up jailed, exiled, or killed. That's a really motivating factor. I mean, it's one of these things you think, like Theresa May loses power and she would be, tossed in jail or God forbid, attacked by an angry mob. But that's a reality of politics in a lot of the world, is that these people are, the sort of carrot is corruption for a lot of them. They want to make money, and being in power allows them to do that. But the stick is that when you lose power, you might die. So, yeah, I mean, there's that fear, I think, is very, very powerful. I think for normal people, I think fear can be paralyzing. And I think for most people, it's much better to think about opportunities and hopes and clear ambitions and goals than it is to be paralyzed by the fear of failure. Because one of the most simple things that I say to my students is to think about the worst possible scenario, and then if it's not that bad, roll the dice. And what I mean by that is, when I was a master's student, I was able to meet with a few heads of state in my research, which was really unusual. But my advisor said, well, try to network, try to sort of, talk to people and see who can open doors for you. And if you fail, you fail. Who cares? You still got closer to that, center of power. And I tried, and in a few cases it worked out. And so I say to students, if you've got somebody who you really want to talk to, who you really want to network with, if you cold contact them, they might not respond. But what are you afraid of? I mean, the worst thing that can happen is you're back at the status quo, and they just don't respond to you. So in that situation, I think taking risks, calculated risks, is a very smart thing for people to do, and it's one that successful people do all the time.
Have you got a specific fear that drives you?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm being honest, the thing that scares me the most is just dying early, which is like probably the most common fear for everyone. But it really, I mean, because of this idea that there's the relationship aspect and the legacy aspect, I don't think, especially on the legacy aspect, that I've done what I want to do. And I think that, the problem is cutting life short before you sort of accomplish that goal. You sort of wonder, would I have lived my life a little differently, right? Would I have done fewer television appearances, for example, if I thought that I only had a much shorter time to live? So I know it's a very sort of cliche example, but that's the thing that really worries me, is that I feel like I have something that I can contribute to the world, and I really don't want that to be cut short. And so that's a note to all the people on Twitter who send me death threats. Please don't do anything. I'd love to be around to to help contribute as much as I can.
Do you use that fear to your advantage a bit, though? You obviously, what I find is that successful people are actually quite aware of their fear, and people that don't feel successful aren't necessarily aware of their fear. Do you think there's something in that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, this sort of mortality, I mean, as dark as it is, I think it's a really good motivating factor. So my uncle, who's taken a very different path from me, and he was a professional windsurfer back in the day, and he's a different personality type than I am. He's a total adventurous guy. He has this saying that he always told me growing up. He says, you only live 30,000 days. And 30,000 days is roughly, I think it's something like 85 years or 80 years of life. And that's just stuck with me. I mean, when you actually quantify it down to the day, and there is a time clock that's ticking on you, whether you like it or not, it's motivating. It says to you, make the most of each day. And I think that is something that I try to do as much as I can. I think it's something where you can very easily let days or months or years slip by. And it's tied to this question. The sort of flip side of fear is a statement that I was told, when I was an undergrad by the president of the college I went to. It was to live deliberately. He told this story that haunted me, of a person at Carleton College, where I was an undergraduate, who died in September 11th. And when the family went through her computer, they had a list of 100 things to do in my life, and like 12 of them were ticked off, and it was just extremely sad, right? But his point was bigger than that. His point was like this person was living the life they wanted to because they thought about what they wanted to do and they were going out and systematically doing it. And to me, that's always been something where I'll occasionally, because of this fear of living only 30,000 days, I will occasionally devote an entire day every once in a while to having that gut check of sort of like, where am I? How far have I gotten towards where I want to be? What are the sort of longer term, shorter term, medium term goals? And how can I actually achieve them? And I think that's really, really easy to lose sight of because most people are just super busy these days. I mean, everybody is busy. You try to schedule dinner with somebody in London and they say, how's it 6 months from now? And I'm, prone to that too. But I do think that it's important to sort of have those gut check days every couple months where you think, am I making the most of my 30,000 days? And I'm not always. I mean, I'm human like everyone else. But I'm trying to do my best, and I think that's a trait that I tend to see in people that end up, getting closer to their goals than others.
Finally, how do you know when you've succeeded? What is success for you?
Well, this is a really difficult question for somebody who does what I do because I talked to my brother about this question. He's a neurologist, and he sees the patients he saves, right? He saves lives and he sees the impact of it. One thing that's difficult when you work in politics is I know that I have done things that have helped, but I don't meet the people that I help necessarily. A great example of this was the campaign I worked on. We won that campaign, and the first action that the governor took was to expand healthcare insurance for roughly 200,000 people. And I sort of think, look, if I contributed to that victory and 200,000 people got their health insurance, that's not bad. I mean, for one lifetime, let alone for one campaign. So I felt very proud of that. I've never met any of those people, right? I've never sort of seen the impact of it. And so one thing that politics has as an upside is that you can affect decisions that make an impact on a huge number of people, but you also never get to see those people and see your work in practice in any sort of concrete sense. And so to me, I do feel like I've made an impact, but it's much, much harder to quantify than people who are in professions that have much more direct human contact. And it's one of the downsides of working in media. On the other hand, in my academic hat, I do see it with students. I'd see students who change their decision-making calculus or their career plans based on advising that I've given them or ways that they've thought about classes that have really impacted them and their thinking. So that's really rewarding too. And you sort of get the success out of those very different types of engagement, and you take it where you can get it. But I think measuring it is something that's difficult. I'm happy with how things are going. I think things are moving in the right direction for me professionally, but I'll never be able to say 100% achieved that goal. You know what I mean? So.
Okay, Brian, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.